Welcome to the first ever episode on the Dreamlet Podcast. In this episode, I'll be answering some questions I got from you guys a while back, which includes questions about me, how I make my content, and other stuff. Let's go ahead and start off with the shortest but biggest question. Cheesy Toast asks, what is your background? This one is definitely a tough question since it's pretty broad, but I'll give you the rundown on some info I would consider my background. So I was born in Los Angeles, California, and lived in a place east of Los Angeles called Rosemead for the earlier half of my life. I'm currently 24. Both of my parents were immigrants that fled from the Vietnam War, so I grew up in a pretty small house. And to be honest, my parents' background and stories are way crazier and more interesting than mine. But I'll save that for probably a future podcast episode. Anyways, from my experience, the neighborhood was relatively safe. I remember waking up one night to our car alarm going off and my dad telling me the next day that a guy broke the window of the car and stole the radio, even though the radio was not detachable. So he basically stole a useless radio because it broke after he detached it. My dad was very upset and pissed off. I just felt shocked that something like that would even happen. I also remember another story from my uncle about this guy who started to approach him. So he got in his car and locked the doors. The guy ran to him and tried opening his car doors. Nothing actually happened for us to get hurt, and that's why I consider it relatively safe, but my mom was very protective. She always warned us to be extremely cautious and careful. I remember always hearing the ice cream trucks and going out with my sister to get ice cream. This was while my mom was at work. So the ice cream guy, Ray, knew us by name and even gave us toys for free. But one day my mom heard we were always going into the streets because of the ice cream truck and told our grandma to stop us from ever going out again. Never saw Ray after that. All these experiences made me quite fearful to be outside of my house area, especially at night. But inside the house area was still game, and I would play with my cousins all the time there. I'd say freeze tag was one of my favorite games, but with not enough people, I started to make up my own games. They were simple, like shouting out a color and then we'd have to run and touch that color, and the last person who touches it loses. But they were fun. We basically just used everything around us, like our shoes and water bottles. We had to stand behind a line and throw our shoe to knock over a water bottle, and the guard is also behind the line, and if the bottle is knocked over, the guard has to run to place the bottle back into the square line, upright, and the thrower has to grab the shoe that was just thrown. I actually learned that one from my dad. There weren't any smartphones or anything like that, so that is essentially what we did. And this is something that followed me to this very day. Every year for my birthday, I get together with my friends and make up a series of games for us to play. I look forward to it every year, and it's one of my favorite things to do. I don't know if that relates to my creative drive today, where I feel the necessity to imagine random things and express them, but I'd say it was definitely part of my highlights as a kid. And water bottles throwing reminds me of a pretty scary memory. I was playing with my younger cousin at my grandma's. We were throwing a filled up water bottle at each other for some reason, and literally the worst possible outcome came to be. I hit her on the head by accident, and the next thing I saw was a lot of blood. The only person home other than us was my grandma, and when she saw, she freaked out. I also freaked out because I caused that blood. My cousin was crying, and luckily my grandma knew what to do to stop the bleeding. But I definitely felt like I was in trouble for this. My grandma called my mom, who called my dad, and I was extremely sorry and had already said sorry a lot. But I remember my dad coming by and seeing that everything was under control. He seemed calm and understanding. He went back to work and I carried on with my day. It was at night when it happened. I was in bed and about to sleep, but my dad told me to come outside. I didn't want to. It was late. I hated being outside in the dark, and I was scared about what was going to happen. I was right to be scared. My dad took me outside, had me kneel on the floor, and whipped me with a metal hanger until I cried. This is the Asian disciplinary way in all its glory. I stayed there crying and kneeling on the cold ground in the dark for a while. Since my cousin's house was connected to mine, our doors were literally 10 meters away from each other, so my dad walked me to the door and rang the doorbell. I remember seeing my cousin's band-aid on her forehead and just feeling extremely guilty and bad. My dad told me to say sorry, so I kept saying it over and over again while I was crying. And my uncle and aunt are pretty nice people, so they were very forgiving. That was the most painful apology I've ever had to deliver in my life so far. And painful in terms of physical pain. I wasn't mad at my dad because I felt like I deserved it. I did something wrong and was punished for it. After all, kneeling and getting hit by stuff was a pretty regular thing whenever I did something wrong as a kid. If you haven't guessed by now, I am Asian American. I'm a mix of Chinese, Vietnamese, and Japanese, predominantly Chinese. The sort of belief that you should be punished if you did something wrong was so strong in me that when I was in high school, I spoke rudely to my grandma. I punished myself by facing a wall and kneeling on the ground for about 20 to 30 minutes. I make it sound like I was such a disciplined kid, but I really wasn't. I was fearful. Fearful that my mom would have punished me had I not punished myself. Fearful that if I did something wrong, I'd get hurt or yelled at. All that fear turned into anger, and that anger was let out on my sister and my cousins. Sure, it was fun and games a lot of the times, but there were also huge arguments between me and my sister, and one of the biggest regrets in my life was being a bully to my cousin. Monkey see, monkey do. My dad hit me when I didn't do what he wanted, so I hit my cousin when he didn't do something I wanted. I made him cry so many times with one punch. So much so that when I began to realize my mistakes and changed in high school, he still flinched whenever I walked next to him. He later told me that he bullied some of his friends growing up. It's a vicious cycle of anger and hate. That's why I'll never punish my kids in the future by any physical means. And this was essentially my Bible when I grew older. Don't do the things inflicted on me from my childhood that made me feel terrible. My dad drank a lot. He would often come home drunk and yell at my mom or sister. He would hit the walls, break furniture occasionally, and storm out of the house. I vowed to my sister that I would never drink in my life. I still haven't and never will. I vowed to my friends that I'll never yell at my future wife. All the anger in me from the old days has mostly disappeared. I almost never feel angry these days. So in many ways, I am grateful that most of that anger came out very early in my life. But honestly, there are a lot of things I feel would have been better off had they not happened in the first place. One of them being the divorce of my parents. There are two very important events that changed a lot of things for me. This is one of them, and the other is moving when I started 8th grade. It felt like I lost my friends and my dad at the same time. I basically cried every single week and felt like my life was miserable. My mom and my sister would have arguments over my dad, and I would feel responsible for all of it. Why? Because before my dad left, he asked me a question. He asked me, a 13-year-old kid, "Son, do you want me to stay or do you want me to be happy?" I told him, "Dad, I love you and I want you to be happy." I thought I was being self-sacrificing, allowing my dad to do what he wanted. But every time I heard my mom start crying randomly in her room, I couldn't take it. I immediately felt regret and anger towards myself, always bursting into tears. I felt like I caused her all this suffering and could never take it back. Of course, later in life, I realized that it wasn't my fault. My dad's choice to leave was his, not mine. I realized that only after high school finished. My dad caused a lot of suffering for our family, but I've already forgiven him for everything. I still love my dad. I understand that life can be very difficult, and sometimes choices are made that fill you with regret later. My sister still hasn't forgiven him. My mom doesn't even want to talk to him. I want him to know that his son still welcomes him with open arms and an open heart. That's the philosophy I chose to adopt after the divorce of my parents and feeling like I lost my friends. I'll discuss that in depth later for my Bonds series. Anyways, I'm pretty sure when you asked that question, what's my background, you didn't mean to ask me for this story, but I felt that it would be a good introduction to the first episode, since you guys can get a better idea of the person who's talking. There are so many stories I would love to share, and I will as these episodes continue. The way I'm organizing this for now is through series names. Dreamlet Blue, Bonds, Lotus, and Ambitions are the first 4 themes of my topics. Ambitions will focus on people who have accomplished something cool, and I'll be asking them about how they got there and the tools that helped them. Lotus will primarily focus on philosophical questions and turning them into practical advice. Bonds is all about approaches to interpersonal life, how to talk to strangers, how to keep in touch with friends, relationship advice, and so on. Blue is generally about stories. My story, my friends' stories, and any story I feel is worth sharing. So to answer your question in a much faster way, I'm Asian American, so I grew up with Asian culture, like get good grades, study, which I suppose led me to being a straight A student with 1 B in high school, which helped me graduate from college 1 year early, majoring in physics, minoring in math, and computer science. I grew up in a small house close to East LA and moved further east after middle school. Some of my favorite hobbies are dance, gymnastics, and playing board games. I am certified to teach piano and plan on starting that up this year. I've been working a part-time job coding in VBA for Excel for about 3 years now. That is a much more general answer to that question. Next one is from Trent. We have a lot in common in terms of our mindset and thoughts on life. Also, Richard Feynman and Elon Musk are inspirations too. Can we be friends? Yeah, sure. I don't know if you'd be listening to this, but I'll comment back where I made the post and say hello. Next one is from RJ. Congrats on 5K subs. We're actually at around 7K subs now, but thank you. I have a snowball, but don't know what effects I should use. I would appreciate it if you could go over what effects you are currently using. Okay, so at first, I actually didn't use any effects on my audio. More recently, I've been experimenting on using the parametric equalizer, or EQ for short. I'm going to be making a video about how to edit for podcasts pretty soon, so I'll let you know when I do. Crew Pally has 2 questions. Does having a pet help with loneliness? Yes, absolutely. I have a dog named Belle, and she has been a huge source of joy in my life. I spend a lot of time editing and alone in my house, so she's always there next to me, and I play with her pretty much every day, so the answer is yes. Second question is, does being lonely make one less and less tolerant to people in personal space? That is a very interesting question that I can only answer for myself, because I'm pretty sure it's different for everyone. I lived in a pretty empty house for a while after college, and then my friend lived with me for about 2 years. I'd say that I definitely preferred having that personal space to myself, but I do miss having my friend around to occasionally talk to in person. We still talk over the phone, but it's not quite the same. My friend, Johnny, asks, what is your favorite color? Of course, he already knows the answer to this, but for people that don't know me, you can probably guess by the name of this podcast series, blue, more specifically the teal shade. John says, congrats. Thanks. Engineering Cars Universe says, thank you for your video guides. They helped me to start my own YouTube channel. And comments like these make me feel pretty awesome because I'm glad my videos could be helpful. Robert asks, how much did your giant whiteboard cost? I got that whiteboard from Walmart at about $24, I believe. I know for sure it was 20 something and less than $27. So that's all the questions for now. Feel free to keep asking me any questions on either this video or any video really, and I'll try to address them either by commenting back if it's a shorter thing or making a video if it's something that requires further explanation. My plans for further podcast episodes for each series involves talking to other people, but whenever I don't get the chance to get someone else on the podcast, I'll make an episode that takes from my own personal experience and do a solo episode. If you feel like you have a story worth sharing or a value you want to express through some form of vocal storytelling, please feel free to contact me and you might be on the next podcast episode. If you're listening on YouTube, please consider heading to the podcast link in the description below and checking out the podcast. It'll help tremendously. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my stories about moments from my childhood. I'll catch you in the next one.